I'm Vinny Schiraldi, co-director of the Columbia University Justice Lab, here to introduce Bruce Western and the panel for tonight's discussion of Bruce's book, Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. Thank you all for coming. I want to mention that we have over 100 people watching us on live stream. For those of you on live stream, there's about 100 people in the room, so it's a fair fight. And welcome from wherever you are. Mary, where's the furthest away? California. Nobody overseas, huh? All right, we'll have to work on that. So I want to start by introducing Bruce Western, my colleague and friend and co-director here at the Columbia University Justice Lab. Before I do that, I just want to mention we weren't able to sell the books here. We realized after we set this up that you're actually not allowed to sell stuff here. We chose not to give you the books. Sorry about that. But there are discounted flyers in the back of the room. Folks want to grab those, so when you go get the book at whatever bookstore you choose to go to, you can get a little bit of a discount. So Bruce is the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy at the Kennedy School and a professor of sociology, both at Harvard University. And he's also co-director of the Justice Lab here at Columbia University, so he's having a difficult time holding down a job. His research is focused on the causes, scopes, and consequences of incarceration in America. He was vice chair of the National Academy of Sciences committee that focused on the causes and consequences of incarceration in the United States that produced this book. If you folks haven't taken a look at this, it's really terrific, and I thought was groundbreaking in the discussion around mass incarceration in America, and is used by lots of policymakers and advocates in that space. I got to go to the Kennedy School at Bruce's invitation to help him run the program in criminal justice there, and was privileged to watch his team, which includes Jackie. Jackie, where are you? There's Jackie. Kendra, and is Jennifer? There's Kendra, and is Jennifer here? Jennifer Arzu didn't make it, but and as well as other folks, and it was just really terrific to watch this sort of intellectual rigor, but also kind of deep passion of Bruce and the team he pulled together. And for me, that I'm primarily a practitioner, to watch both the research rigor with which folks were really calling balls and strikes on what they found through the research, but also the concern and care that they had about the folks that they were interviewing, and that they weren't just lab rats. They were people they were living real lives. They were engaged in real struggles. And I think when I think about the contribution that the book has made to my thinking and to the field, that to me sums it up. There's an enormous amount of important data, important information that unless you've gone through reentry from prison, those folks know a lot about that, but that the rest of us don't get to really know. But it's presented in a very human and decent way, and I think that's a rare combination, and that's the combination that Bruce brings to the field. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. He's going to do some reading from the book and discussion of the book, and then I'll introduce our panel of experts, Vivian, Nixon, and Khalil Cumberbatch, and we'll engage in the discussion, and hopefully that discussion will be with the folks in the audience as well. Okay, take it away, Bruce.
Thanks very much, Vinny. I'm really honored by this event. When Vinny proposed that we do something on the book, I thought it was a very nice way of beginning a discussion that the Justice Lab could host for the Columbia community. When Vinny suggested that Khalil and Vivian join the panel, I was just delighted, and I'm really eager for the conversation that we're about to have. And so what I thought I would do is I'll speak relatively briefly, I hope, for about 15 minutes. That's my plan. So give me a nudge at the appropriate time. And I'll say a little bit about the book. I'll do a short reading, and then I'll hand it off to Vivian and Khalil. But let me tell you a little bit about this book. It grew out of research I've been doing over the last, I guess, 15 or nearly 20 years now. And as Vinny was saying, a lot of the work I was doing before the research in Boston was focused on the causes, the scope, the consequences of very high rates of incarceration in the United States. And as this room knows very well, the incarceration rate right now is historically high. There's about 2.1 million people in prison or jail, and the statistic that this room knows very well, I know, is that the United States accounts for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Our incarceration rate is 700 per 100,000. Western Europe, by comparison, is about 100 per 100,000. So we're out of sync with international standards in the scale at which we're locking people up in prison or jail. And as striking as that is, for me, that's not the most important thing about incarceration in the United States. The most important thing about incarceration in the United States, from my perspective as a sociologist, is its unequal distribution across the population. And we know, of course, that there's a very large racial disparity in incarceration. African Americans are about 6 or 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. And there's a large class inequality as well. Becky Pettit and I, we tried to look at this, estimating cumulative risks of imprisonment, lifetime risks of imprisonment. What are the chances that you're ever going to prison at some point in your life? And we looked at a birth cohort born in the late 1970s. So if you're born in the late 1970s, you're reaching your mid-30s around 2010. And we asked, well, what are the chances you're ever going to go to prison? Among African-American men, if they never went to college, non-college African-American men, that's about half of all black men in that birth cohort, there's a 35% chance that they're going to go to prison at some point in their lives. If they dropped out of high school, there's a 70% chance that they'll go to prison at some point in their lives. If you go back a generation, the incarceration rates were much lower. So this is very new. These very, very high rates of incarceration, the ubiquitous presence of the criminal justice system in the lives of disadvantaged black men has only emerged in the last few decades. So for me, this created a real sense of moral urgency, and I began to talk about these findings, and I did congressional testimony and talked to elected officials and proposed policy reforms. And I thought the statistics would speak for themselves. And anyone who says, I thought the statistics would speak for themselves, should not be allowed anywhere near the political process. And it was very frustrating. It was a very frustrating sort of time. But during this time, as I was doing this research, I was also going into prison a lot. And I was getting to know people who are incarcerated. I was getting to know people who worked in the system. And I was hearing lots of stories. And I was hearing stories about the lives of people and the path that brought them to prison. And those lives and those stories were missing from the statistics that I was trying to talk to policymakers about. And I thought it would be important to try and gain proximity, as Brian Stevenson would say, try and gain proximity to the lives and stories of people who are affected by mass incarceration. And that's what motivated the Boston Reentry Study, which is the research base for this new book, Homeward. So the Boston Reentry Study is a longitudinal interview study. And we were talking to people, 122 people who are incarcerated in Massachusetts prisons, and they were returning to neighbourhoods around the Boston area. And we followed them over a year. We interviewed them 5 times over a year. The first time, just before prison release, we went into all the prisons in the Massachusetts system, and we talked to people in maximum security, in reentry centres. We talked to people behind plexiglass in non-contact units. We talked to respondents in shackles. Sometimes we went into the hole, speaking to people who are about to release to the street a few days later. We went to secure wards in psychiatric hospitals. We went to the state psychiatric facility. We got incredible access from the DOC. And this was a broad cross-section of people releasing from prison in Massachusetts. 3 main findings I want to emphasize quickly. And I felt the data were really rich, and we learned a lot, and we're still in the process of writing it up. But if I were to pick out 3 things, it would be these 3. First, and we weren't expecting this going in, but it may be familiar to people in this room, we were struck by the sheer extent of violence in the lives of the people we were interviewing. And oftentimes that violence began in early childhood and it extended over the life course. So we heard lots of stories about family violence. We heard lots of stories about kids being beaten by their parents, stories of sexual abuse, disorderly neighbourhoods that people were growing up in, lots of adolescent fighting. Nearly all of our sample reported that they got in a lot of fights in adolescence, and their exposure to violence continued into adulthood as well. The violence we heard about was of a very contextual kind. It emerged quite distinctively, I thought, under the conditions of poverty in which people were living. The homes that our respondents grew up in were often quite chaotic. Unrelated adult males were often in the household. Often family members suffered from untreated addiction, which could also contribute to instability in the homes. Sometimes mothers worked long hours and kids were left unsupervised, and that was also a source of a lack of structure. And in these kinds of home environments, violence became more likely. Similarly for the neighbourhoods people grew up in. The main implication of this contextual kind of violence is that people came to play all sorts of roles in violence. They were victimised by it, they were witnesses to it, and certainly they engaged in violence. They committed violence as well. So for most of the people we were interviewing, there were serious histories of violent victimisation, serious histories of witnessing violence that extended from early childhood, emerging under conditions of poverty, which were ubiquitous in the sample. So for me, the whole criminal justice fiction that draws a very bright line between innocent victims on the one hand and guilty offenders on the other did not correspond to the reality that we were observing in the field in Boston at all. Victims and offenders weren't 2 different groups of people as far as we could see. They were the same people. And for me, that affects the moral equation, the foundations of our system of punishment, and it opens the door to mercy and leniency. And I think that's one of the policy implications of the book. Okay, second thing, human frailty. There was a lot of poor health, poor mental health in the sample that we were interviewing. So poor physical health, a lot of chronic disease, chronic pain, very high rates of infectious disease, and chronic pain that was often related to long-term drug use. As well, people were in poor mental health. We observed a lot of mood disorders like depression and PTSD and anxiety, and for a subset in our sample there was real serious mental illness, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which had been poorly treated in part because of people's lengthy criminal justice involvement. The two things are related. Trauma in childhood is related to human frailty in adulthood. The people who had the greatest exposure to early childhood violence were in the poorest physical and mental health in adulthood. Third thing we learned was about the process of reentry itself, and we observed enormous material hardship immediately after prison release. The median income in the sample in the year after prison release was about $6,400. And that's a level of deep poverty, what poverty researchers call deep poverty, about half the federal poverty line for an individual living alone. No independent housing. We observed virtually no independent housing in the year after prison release. People were doubling up or in shelters or sober houses or street homeless. So very serious housing insecurity, about 50% unemployment throughout the year after release. So very acute material hardship. People were leaving prison for poverty. That was the transition that we observed. These things were also related to human frailty. The people who were doing it hardest in our sample were those who suffered most from physical and mental health problems. Two main policy implications, I think, and there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm just trying to paint things in broad strokes. One is in the reentry process itself, and we know that the overwhelming focus of criminal justice policy is on the problem of recidivism. About 25% of our sample returned to custody in the year after prison release. Much of the reincarceration that we observed was well beyond the control of the respondents themselves, and certainly well beyond the control of the criminal justice we're really overlooking the very serious material hardship that we observed in the first year of incarceration. And something I'd like to try and do with the book is refocus the policy conversation from the problem of recidivism to the problem of social integration after incarceration. I think that is the policy goal that I would like to be discussing, and that's what I learned from the study. Second policy implication, I think, is exactly goes to the moral foundations of our system of punishment in this world that is so fundamentally saturated with moral complexity under conditions of really severe poverty that's so characteristic of American society, in which the safety net is so thin. Our criminal justice system winds up piling punishment upon people who are the most disadvantaged and have very significant histories of victimization themselves. And I think we need to find a way of talking about mercy and leniency for people who are currently coming into conflict with the law. Okay, that's the book in a nutshell. I want to do a quick reading. Can I do that? Do I have 45 seconds? That's hard. That is hard. So this is a reading from the book, and I'm sort of piecing together different passages from different places. So I'll quickly read this and I'll close and turn it over to my excellent panelists. So this begins with a paragraph called, from the third chapter, called Transitions. Jerry called the day he got out of prison. He'd just been released that afternoon, taken in handcuffs to a reentry centre on Boston's South Shore. He was told that the centre could help him find a job and get treatment, but he only stayed a few minutes to get directions to the train. A white man in his 50s, Jerry returned to his neighbourhood in South Boston to meet his father. He looked for the old man at the station and then tried calling him, feeding quarters into a payphone. Unable to reach him, he went to a coffee shop to regroup. I was at a Dunkin' Donuts and threw an iced coffee into the trash and turned around and saw him, he said. Jerry had been locked up for 19 years. I was just standing there. I felt like a convict, holding my little bag. I felt like I escaped. The first days and weeks after leaving prison can be filled with anxiety and loneliness. We called it the stress of transition. For some, like Jerry, who had a history of drug problems and mental illness, the stress was acute and was associated with unemployment and unstable housing and reincarceration months later. Each step in the transition from prison to community is an opportunity for either social integration or isolation. Right at release, around half the people we interviewed were picked up from prison by family or friends. The rest set out on a more solitary path, delivered by a prison van to a train or re-entry centre, or just walking through the prison gates by themselves. For some, the transition was marked by a welcome home party. Welcome home events were organised by mothers and siblings, with family and friends attending. But the parties were thrown more for those whose minds were sound and whose bodies were unravaged by drugs. Of those with mental illness and drug addiction, only 1 in 6 received a welcome home party. Jerry left incarceration in a prison van and went to a shelter, where his release went uncelebrated. When I talked to him a week after getting out, he said his greatest difficulty was dealing with the mental stimulus. He described the shock of release. It's very overwhelming. You have to understand the situation I was in, where for the last 19 years, nothing changed. The view, for the most part, the people, the routine, everything was the same. Suddenly, there's sight, there's sounds, options, everything all at once. Bam, there's no transition. In the first week after release, about 40% of our respondents described feelings of anxiety or panic. They were often distressed by public transport and crowded places like stores and nightclubs. Many respondents stayed off trains and buses for the first few months to avoid being jostled by strangers. Despair, isolation, and all the ensuing limitations could be paralysing, depleting energy for the dozens of tasks that accompany the first weeks after prison. Getting identification, applying for food stamps, buying clothes, seeing a doctor, going to parole, and countless other practicalities could feel overwhelming. Prisons, for all of their various effects, create an important event, leaving. And that begins a struggle for social belonging. Freedom after prison is not granted by release, but it's attained gradually. Becoming free first requires adjusting to the everyday tasks and interactions of free society and leaving behind the habits of the institution. After getting out of prison, Jerry spent hours downtown in Boston watching office workers walk by from the towers around his homeless shelter. I once saw him sitting alone on a park bench while I was interviewing another respondent. He sat for an hour by himself around midday, looking out on the square. He told me of his people watching, "I fall in love with everyone and no one falls in love with me." Perhaps the key lesson of the reentry study says something deep about the nature of incarceration. We usually think of incarceration as a deprivation of liberty, a loss of autonomy. But the men and women leaving prison in Boston were also disconnected from the intimate bonds of family, friendship, work, and community. We saw in the stress of transition a strange kind of homesickness that endured even as the respondents returned. life and all the relationships that comprise it felt alien. And until it became more familiar, they were not yet home.
Thanks, Bruce. That was very powerful. I appreciate it. I'm going to introduce our panelists now, and I'm going to have a little dialogue, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and answers and more dialogue. Vivian Nixon is the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, which works to remove barriers to higher education for women. She's also President of the Board of Directors of Just Leadership USA. She developed a passion for these issues while as a peer educator in the Albion State Correctional Facility in New York. She's the recipient of a number of honors at John Jay Medal for Justice, the Ascend Fellowship at the Aspen Institute, and the Soros Justice Fellowship, and is an MFA candidate still, or because it's late May now. Oh, first year, okay. MFA candidate here at Columbia University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Khalil Cumberbatch serves as an Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society. He was previously a Manager of Training at Just Leadership USA, and is a lecturer here at Columbia University School of Social Work, teaches a mass incarceration course that sells out in the first 5 minutes every year. After being held in detention for 5 months on immigration charges, he was one of only 2 recipients to receive an executive pardon from New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo to prevent his deportation from the United States. So, you know, in Bruce's statements here and his so let's do this now for them. In Bruce's reading and discussion of the book, he used words describing people coming home from prison like frail and sort of violent, victims of violence, people who receive and give love. These are not, one of the things that struck me about the book is these aren't words that we usually hear associated with people coming out of prison. It's very antithetical to the script that I think most Americans walk around with. I guess there's really sort of 2 questions I want to attach to this, and then you can react in any way you want to react. One is does this fit with the reentry path you yourselves or people you know experienced, and what in the book and what Bruce read strikes you the most? And you can come here, or you can just turn those things on in front of you. I don't know that they're on. You might want to hit them just in case they could be on.
Great. Hello, everyone. Wow. So Vinny read some of my favorite passages from the book. I want to start by, and I am going to somehow answer those 2 questions, okay. But, you know, when they send you to media training, you know what they teach you?
Don't answer the
No matter what the question is, answer the question you want to answer. But I am going to actually answer those questions. I want to start by saying, though, I just finished reading this book last night, cover to cover. It is the first academic book on mass incarceration and the process of reentry that I've ever read cover to cover. The rest of them I have skimmed because I already knew what was in them. I am almost at a loss for words because I found this book very deeply moving at a personal level, because I feel like and felt like while I was reading that I knew every one of the respondents that Bruce wrote about. And I felt like the language that was used to describe them, their lives, and their communities was compassionate and human in a way that no researcher I have read has ever managed to find voice for. I knew this was a different book when I read Bruce's description of the phrase that has been written about before, but his description of the phrase invisible inequality. It struck me like a bolt of lightning because I have known what it's like to feel invisible. And I'm going to really try to get through these remarks because I just finished the book and it really did have a profound impact on me. There are two sets of characters I want to talk about because it mimics my reentry experience most closely. There are a brother and sister named Kate and AJ, who are what they call Irish twins. I was born in January. My brother William was born in December. So we are Irish twins. 1960, same year. Unlike Kate and AJ is the guy who went to prison. I was the sister who went to prison, and I had a brother who did everything right. And like Kate, it was my brother who welcomed me home and made sure that I did not have the same isolating and debilitating experiences as others in the book, like Jerry and Omar. I came home, and the next day, I stayed with my mother. I lived with my mother at the time, and my brother drove to my mother's house. I had been in prison 4 years with my car. So my car was still there. And he said, okay, now my brother's not an emotional person. He's very practical. He's an accountant. He said, okay, I got it tuned up. There's new tires and it's full of gas. Do what you got to do. Right? Just that was a huge advantage over everybody else who was getting out. And then I read about Omar, who had a severe car accident at a young age, and I'm sure was put on heavy-duty painkillers for some time and became addicted to heroin. And I remember how heroin addicts were treated in the 80s and still are in some communities where it's not considered a prescription opioid crisis, but some other kind of crisis. And I remember addiction, and I remember the lack of control one has over the need to use the drug. That people look at you and really think that you're making a decision that, oh, today I think I'll use some heroin, when it is a physical response. Your brain actually changes when you use opioids for an extended period of time. And without them, you absolutely do not feel normal. You cannot function. You do not know how to take care of your daily needs, because what you need at that moment is to feel normal again. There is a point at which addicts no longer get high, especially with opioids. It's just about feeling normal. This is the first book that ever made that clear to me. The way that we've used mega data in our society to say this many people are on drugs, this many black people are in prison for committing crimes, whether violent or nonviolent, this many black men don't graduate, this many. The way we use mega data in our society dehumanizes us all, because we can all fit into some category of mega data, whether positive or negative, that does not tell the entire story of who we are. I said all that to just thank Bruce for writing this book, because you've changed the game. From now on, people who write about reentry as an experience of numbers of people in and out of prison won't have any meaning unless they refer back to this work. So I told you my beginning experience coming out of prison. I was one of the lucky ones. I had a family who cared and who provided me with the basic necessities I needed. I did not work for 18 months. It took me 18 months to find work. In the midst of finding work, though, what I found was what Bruce talks about so eloquently, is a community that cared. And I imagine that the reason such a large percentage of the people in your study you were able to follow that long was because they saw your research team as part of a community that cared what happened to them. College and Community Fellowship, where I'm the executive director, was a brand new organization at the time. It had been in existence for less than a year when I got out of prison, and March 17th, 2001. CCF had been in existence since 2000. And when I got the flyer saying that there was this new organization in New York City that wanted to help women coming out of prison to achieve higher levels of education, I thought that was of interest to me, even though I lived on Long Island. But remember, I had a family who said, okay, we're going to give you the $10.50 round trip train fare to go to the CCF meetings, to go meet with your academic counselor. If I didn't have that, I couldn't have been part of CCF, right? But I was able to be part of CCF, and I was able to graduate with a bachelor's degree in nonprofit management. And I was able to learn more about the societal structures, the sociological implications, the economic implications of incarceration, the racial structures that promote incarcerations of certain communities. And that is what drove my career to this day. And I have a wonderful career that I love, because that first year when I was out, I had the support I needed, and I attached that support to opportunity to receive a higher level of education through CCF. So I have nothing more to say. I'm sure there'll be more questions. But in answer to Vinny's questions, which I have now forgotten.
You nailed it. I mean, you talked about whether
this book is groundbreaking. And I think it will help not only a lot of individuals, but a lot of researchers look at the numbers that they're reporting on in a different way. And hopefully the policy implications will follow. Thank you very much.
Ditto. Everything that Vivian just said. Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be sitting with folks that I admire and really value in this work. But it is even better when they have a fireplace behind you.
With real wood.
With real wood, hopefully.
I don't know about producing the portrait.
No, but the fireplace. I didn't say purposefully. So that's an added benefit. Hope the pictures catch that in the background. So I too will try to pivot the questions. First, I think it's important for me to say that when I first heard of the book and the title specifically, there were two things in the title that jumped out at me. One was the word home, and the second one was the word life. And although when we talk about reentry, those are terms that are generally thrown around to give some context into what we're really talking about, the reality is that it means different things for different people. And I thought about what it meant for me when I was in prison, what home meant for me, what a life after prison meant for me. And the reality is, although I, just like Vivian, was very fortunate to have a family who supported me not only after my incarceration but during my incarceration, home and life just wasn't what I had envisioned it to be. So here I am as a very privileged person receiving benefits from my family who was in a very good place to receive me, but yet and still what I had envisioned as being home and life was still not matching that. And in remembering that, I think about the people who don't have that. I returned, anytime I talk about my reentry, I always say that I can talk about my experience as a cis male returning to a major metropolitan city that has a tremendous amount of resources on the East Coast. Because if we talked about this in Westchester County or even in Nassau and Suffolk, it could mean a very different thing. When I came home from day one, I had no qualms about saying very publicly and openly that I had been convicted of a felony. I had served 6.5 years in prison, not as a badge of honor, but because I had refused to be beholden to stigma and shame that's associated with a felony conviction. However, I understand that there are many people, even in this city, who just can't do that, who just can't say that, who can't live in that way. And if you combine that with histories of trauma, histories of absorbing a narrative that tells them that they're not worthy, that they're not good enough, anything that they've ever done or will do is not good enough, it can only cause a person to be even more isolated. And then I thought about what home and life meant for me after immigration detention. Bruce's book talks a lot about reentry after prison, which undoubtedly is filled with barriers that are legal and even ones that are immeasurable, right? So even if we got rid of all of the policies and legislation that legally discriminate against people with criminal convictions, we still have to tackle the biggest one, which is the perception of who it is that we're talking about. So even if we did that, it still doesn't mean that someone will always transition in a way that's most healthy for them. And in thinking about that, I thought about immigration reentry, as Vinny mentioned in the description when he read my bio, that I spent 5.5 months in immigration detention. After being home for 4 years, and was 1 week away from completing a master's degree, and Immigration Customs Enforcement came to my home, arrested me, and detained me for what ultimately ended up being 5.5 months, but what could have been much, much longer. And it was because of a huge advocacy fight on my behalf that some of the folks sitting on this panel and some of the folks sitting in this room were a part of to get me out of immigration detention and returning to a family again who was in a place to receive me. Home and life just wasn't what I had envisioned it to be during my time in immigration detention. And so I want us to just keep that in mind, that as we're having these conversations, that it is leaving out a good chunk of the people that we're talking about, people who also are re-entering in a different way, and keeping in mind that most people who are in immigration detention are re-entering to another country. We're talking about one city in a state, but there are people who, after being detained and deported in immigration detention, are returning to a country that they actually do not call home. It is a country of their birth, but they don't have any real connection to. So I just wanted us to keep that in mind. And then the last thing I'll say is that keeping in mind that I returned to a major metropolitan, all of those things, right? I was also very fortunate to be at a facility during my incarceration for 6.5 years called Greenhaven Correctional Facility. And Greenhaven Correctional Facility, unbeknownst to me at that time, was a facility that had a very deep history in programs that were developed and implemented and facilitated by men who were incarcerated for men who were incarcerated. And while the state programs existed, they were not the ones that had the most transformative impact on my life, and I would dare to say on many people's life. Most people that I've talked to about successful quote-unquote reentry have attributed those programs to some change in their behavior, in their perception, in their mentality. And so my reentry, quite honestly, started while I was incarcerated. And the first time I ever heard someone tell me that outright, that if you wait till the day that you got out of prison to talk about your game plan, you've already lost. Because the reality is that as hard as this is for you to understand, you're right now, you're just practicing. The real game, quote unquote, begins after you are released. And for someone who was a very young man, not only in age, but also in mentality, that was mind-blowing for me. It quite literally changed the way that I saw my entire incarceration and the way that I saw myself after my incarceration. So I wanted to say that because that's something that's also often lacking, is a very rich conversation about what happens while a person is incarcerated, and all too often is a captive audience, literally and figuratively, and that giving them access to programs, not just state-ran programs, programs that are developed and implemented by the people themselves incarcerated, can actually have a very meaningful impact on someone's life. And then the last thing I'll say is that after I got out, I went to the organization that I work for now, which is the Fortune Society. I had met a man incarcerated while I was on the back end of my incarceration. I was only a few months away from being released, and I met a man named Larry Lukeman White, who for all intents and purposes in the New York State prison system is a living legend. And I never met him. I had met men who he had mentored and tutored, who mentored and tutored other men, who then tutored and mentored me. And so there was this direct line to him that he didn't know, but I knew. And so when I met him, I introduced myself, and I told him my story. I told him I was getting ready to come home, and he said, when you come home, you should come to the Fortune Society. And so I did that. I went there. And Fortune gave me many things, including training that helped me answer the felony question. This is pre-Fair Chance Act in New York City. And so being asked the felony question on an interview or an application was a very real possibility. But Fortune also showed me, it helped me to reshape what the mold I thought after, life after prison, what I thought was possible for me. Fortune showed me people who were doing things in positions and helping people in a way that I never envisioned for myself. And it really helped me to reshape the mold of what was really possible for me after incarceration. And I say that, again, to highlight that that's also another part of the conversation that we should keep in mind, is that there aren't always community, college and community fellowship, Fortune Society, the Osborne Association, CCA, all of these organizations in New York City. There are many places across the country where reentry looks like your family and you.
Then we'll go back to you, and then we'll go back to you.
Hello, my name is Ishmael Igartua. I'm with Housing Works SMART program. So my name is Ishmael Igartua. I'm with the Housing Works SMART program. It's a prison reentry city jail reentry program. So, Professor, you accurately captured some of my experiences. I served 29 years in prison, and I'm home 2 years. I had a similar experience to your panelists, that my reentry was smoother, made so because of education. I pursued vigorously education inside of prison, and I was very fortunate to have a good reentry. I'm wondering if, in your book, and I look forward to reading it, if you discuss aging people returning home and what that might entail.
Yeah. It's really important, and I do. So the average age of our sample was about 34 years old. And so we spoke to a lot of people in their 40s and 50s, and which is older typically than how you think about people who are involved in the criminal justice system. they were following a different path. It was a harder road for people who are older. They had less family support. They were more likely to be in a shelter system or sober houses. They had often struggled with addiction and mental health problems over a whole lifetime. They were much more isolated. In the first week after prison, older people spent more time idle and on their own. And so there was more loneliness and social isolation. And they found it harder to get work, and their housing was more unstable over the whole year. I think older people left out of the policy conversation, and clearly as the prison population is aging, it's going to become a more and more significant problem. And I think we haven't really seriously thought about the challenges of reentry for people who may not go back to the labour market, who just may not be working again after incarceration. And I think that's a real implication of an ageing prison population, and particularly the problems of reentry that are specific to older people.
Good evening. My name is Jarrell Dames. I'm a research assistant for the Center for Justice at Columbia University. I'm in between of what everybody's saying. I've heard people speak about violence. I'm hearing people speak about the transitional service and building urban development around reentry. I want to focus everybody's attention on the behavioral part of an individual. People need cognitive thinking training before being released from prison, and they need immediate hands-on training upon being released. Everybody in this room who's been formerly incarcerated has a trauma that they experience from that duration of being incarcerated. But that issue, that trauma that we're dealing with from day-to-day basis is not being addressed. We have ART, anger aggression training, which is far to the left. We have ASAC, alcohol substance abuse training, far to the right. In the middle, there's nothing to correct the behavior of the individual. There's no cognitive thinking change going on. There's no moral integrity development going on. And I just wanted to ask you a question. Do we have any policies underway or in the process of being developed to create an organization or an initiative that addresses that issue of dealing with those traumatic experiences that we experience on the front end, inside the household, domestic violence, physical abuse, then dealing with the extreme violence in the prison system, dealing with that reentry process, the anxiety, the stress of dealing with that? What kind of behavioral thinking programs are available to us or in the works of being constructed?
I think you guys should jump in.
So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been used in the reentry field for many years, and I'm nothing against cognitive behavioral therapy, and some people largely benefit from that. But there are also other ways to change behaviors, and behaviors often change when circumstances change. To go back to Khalil's earlier point about addressing some of the systemic issues like lack of access to a healthy living environment, housing, food, meaningful employment can alter one's behavior because, one has kind of a motivation to respond to the social compact. Bruce talks about this in his book, that it is hard for people to act in agreement with the social compact when the society in which they're living has not fulfilled their end of that social compact. That is to provide people with the basic necessities of or opportunity to pursue happiness, opportunity to have a healthy and sustainable life, opportunity to thrive. I'm not saying everybody should just be freely given that, but there are basic human rights that need to be under consideration. So if you're living in a society within you feel your basic human rights are totally disrespected and or ignored, you're much likely to adjust your behavior to match the moral code of ethics or the social compacts of the society in which you are living.
And then the to answer your question, because you mentioned about ART and ASAT, right, or KSAC, which are, those are two state-ran programs, at least here in New York State. There's equivalents all across the country. Different corrections department call it different things. And I took both of them. I took ART because the state told me that I was convicted of a violent offense, and so therefore I must have had an anger issue, and so therefore they placed me in ART. And then they put me in ASAP or KSAT. The name may have changed since my time in the system, which is a 6-month drug treatment program, quote unquote. It's a residential drug treatment program, at least in the facility where I was at. And it was because when I was in downstate, they asked me had I ever used any drugs, and I said, yeah, I smoked marijuana for like 4 or 5 months at a time. And so therefore I must have had a drug a problem, right? And so they put me in that. And I don't want to take away from the fact that there are some people who have life-changing experiences in those programs. That was not my story. As a matter of fact, it was a waste of my time, quite honestly, and I did it because the state said I had to do it. Where I learned the most on how to change my perception, how to change my behavior, how to change my mentality, how to change what I knew was expected of me after I was leaving prison, and even during my incarceration, was at the hands of the men who were incarcerated. And I would assume that the women have the same exact experience, that all of my mentors, all of my tutors, all of the people who gave me those aha moments that CBT may call it something else, and I also too don't have that much of a problem with CBT. I do have a problem with it, and other ones too. But that I had those moments at the hand of men who were incarcerated, who showed me those moments using a tactic that may have a nice name to it that CBT calls, or MRT, or whatever else, but the reality is that they literally stripped back all of the layers of me as a human being and showed me as best as they could that a lot of the stuff that I was told was just outright bullshit. The fact that I was told that as a young man of color, I was expected to behave a certain way, that I was expected to view women a certain way, that I was expected to act a certain way, that I was expected to use violence as my language, that I was expected to carry a gun and use it in any shape, form, or fashion that I could to instill fear in others. All of that was taught to me by men who were incarcerated. And so I say that to say that there is an answer to that. And it's called the Youth Assistance Program, it's called Alternatives to Violence Project, it's called many different things inside of the facilities. And it's not surprising that when you see men and women who come home after 29 years and 2 years out, college is always a part of that conversation. Because you ask any college student, when have you been asked to use your critical analysis skills the most? For most people, it's in college. It's not in high school, it's not in junior high school, and it's not in elementary school. That's regurgitative learning, that you're told something and you're told to tell it back. And the people who do really well can regurgitate it the best. But when you're in college, for the most part, you're expected to critically analyze information. And the moment you start using that part of your brain, you start questioning everything that was ever told to you, everything that you remember, all the experiences that you had, all the decisions that you made. And so it's not that we don't know what the answer to that question is, we do. But the reality is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's about political will. It's about a risk pension, like we have to have a high pension for risk. And we have to go back to some of the things that the people themselves who have the most to lose and the most to gain, they tell us what they want. The state right now could tell you right now what would work best to keep the population engaged, to give them access to resources that they need. But the reality is that the higher that goes up the chain is the less likely that it is for it to happen. Because the moment it has to go in front of a commissioner or in front of a governor or in front of anybody else that has a title, the one thing they're thinking is, how does this look? Does it look like we're giving away free college to quote-unquote criminals? Does it look like we are not hard on crime? Does it look like we don't care about the victims? When the reality is that you could give access to programs and still address all of that. Because as my good friend Tyson says, good programming is good security. And so it's not surprising that the facilities that have that highest incidences of violence are the ones that also have the least programming. And that is true all across the country, even in the federal system. And so we know what the answer is, whether it's called something jazzy or not, like cognitive behavioral therapy, is another thing. But the reality is that it does happen within the system.
Let's go to the last question, because we're coming up on the end of time, and we'll wrap up from there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carrie Hardy, and I just had a question about your research. So I think it's interesting how much you addressed race in regards to incarceration and rates. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and both my mom's side and my dad's side is from Alabama. And so I wanted to talk to you about Southern poverty, and also when it comes to Caucasian people. Does your book, I didn't get a chance to read it, I just heard about it today, but it sounds so interesting and I want to read it. Does your book address at all, I guess, poverty when it comes to Caucasian communities in the South? And even though drugs might not be as a pervasive issue, there's a really big problem with alcoholism. And, I've seen this, and, going to school, even in high school, because I grew up in a small town outside of Savannah, Georgia, kids who were poor and white and didn't do well in school and did have parents sometimes who were incarcerated. And so I wanted to know if your book addresses that.
Yeah, well, so our field site was in Boston, and so, this was really a case study in the experience of incarceration and its aftermath in the Northeast. But Boston is an important case in this respect because it's one of the few cities in America in which there's still concentrated pockets of white urban poverty. And we were definitely in those communities in our field research in South Boston and East Boston and Charlestown. And white poverty looked different from black poverty to us. And the white respondents in our study tended to be older, had struggled with drug addiction, high rates of mental illness, and if there is an institutional failure that was producing the incarceration among the white respondents we were interviewing, I would say it was really a particular kind of public health failure, and there was a really acute health crisis among the whites in our sample. All the alcoholism was among our white respondents by and large, and the opioid use. The black and Latino respondents in the study tended to be younger, tended to struggle at school. Most had not finished high school, and had real employment problems. And so if there was an institutional failure that produced the incarceration among the African Americans and Latinos that we spoke to, it was a failure of economic opportunity. And so in very broad strokes, that's sort of how I see the varieties of poverty, the racial differences in the varieties of poverty that were linked to the experience of incarceration in the study.
So I want to thank this audience full of really terrific questions. This was a great dialogue. I'd like to also thank Reverend Vivian Nixon and Khalil Cumberbatch for being great respondents, and of course my friend Bruce Western, author of Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. See you again.